Hello, and thanks for stopping by. If you ever happen to find yourself in Borough Market and are able to tear yourself away from the overwhelming and very tempting array of food, there's a far quieter place nearby which really is worth seeing. Here, let me show you. The spot in question is just around the corner from the market, tucked away inside Southwark Cathedral. You can access it from Montague Close. Take a walk along this corridor and you'll come to this space, which essentially allows you to peer back through time. The excavations seen here were carried out in 1999 when an extension to the cathedral was being built. And in unearthing this cavern-like space, archaeologists were able to peel back the many layers of the city's history. As you can see, there's a fascinating assortment of eras represented here, from the remains of a Roman road to a 13th century stone coffin, and from more relatively recent times, some Victorian leather piping. This display clearly demonstrates that, as a populated area, Borough is very old indeed, almost 2,000 years old in fact. For as long as the City of London has stood on the northern shore of the Thames, and it has been a London Bridge to access it, there has been a borough to the south, an area that's evolved over time to serve the needs of travellers heading to and from the capital. There are many more hidden corners to discover in Borough, and in this video, I'd like to show you 5 such secret spots, all of which go some way to telling the story of this historic district. Back in medieval times, when London was a relatively small, walled city, in other words the area now known as the historic Square Mile, Borough lay just outside the city's jurisdiction, meaning it was far less regulated, and essentially, this enabled it to become London's naughtier cousin, a place where people flocked to indulge in all manner of drunken mischief. Until Westminster Bridge opened in 1750, the only direct connection between London and routes to the south was via London Bridge, of which there have been a number of incarnations over the centuries, the most notable being the medieval crossing, which survived for an impressive 600 years, and famously was crammed with shops and houses. Being such a key thoroughfare, this meant London Bridge was always crowded, packed with pedestrians, carts and cattle, and as you tried to trudge your way across, you no doubt also risked having the contents of a chamber pot, hauled from an upper story window, ditched on your head. Furthermore, London's gates, which included one on London Bridge, the roof of which was tastefully topped with the decapitated heads of traitors, were promptly closed at night to keep out the rabble. Therefore, if you wished to avoid the crowds, or were travelling after sunset, the best way to get to Borough was via a small type of skiff-like boat known as a wherry, a fleet of which were operated by wherrymen who'd hustle for business on the banks of the Thames. The wherry, or in more modern parlance, ferrymen, were essentially the predecessors to London's cabbies, and just like the city's taxi drivers today, who are required to demonstrate they have an intricate knowledge of London streets, the ferrymen were expected to have a specialist knowledge too, that being a sound understanding of the nature of the Thames, which is a dangerous river to navigate. Even more so during the medieval period, as the currents in this area were made treacherous by the many arches that propped up the old London Bridge. So, if you were heading home after a hectic night out in the borough and wanted to lift back across the river, you'd walk along the shoreline calling out "oars" in a similar way to saying "taxi", and in doing so, you may well have encountered an available ferryman perched on this little bench. This is the ferryman's seat, which you can see hidden away on Bear Gardens, a road I'll be seeing more of later, and it's an artefact which I like to think of as London's earliest cab rank. It's a simple thing, a seat which was provided to allow ferrymen to rest upon as they awaited their next fare, but just imagine the stories it could tell. It's not too much of an exaggeration, considering their associations with this area, that the likes of William Shakespeare or Samuel Pepys may well have once hired a boat from here. The exact age of the ferryman's seat is unknown, although it was most likely first placed here in either the 12th or 13th century. Located on Pickford's Wharf, these ruins represent all that remains of a grand property known as Winchester Palace, which, as the name indicates, once belonged to the Bishops of Winchester. At first, hearing about such a connection may sound a little puzzling. After all, Winchester is a city in its own right, located 60 miles away from London in Hampshire. To understand where this association comes from, it must be remembered that in medieval times, bishops were very powerful individuals indeed, for as well as their associations with the church, they also acted as politicians and statesmen, and one of the most powerful dioceses in the land was that of Winchester, largely due to the fact that Winchester Castle was home to both the Royal Treasury and the Domesday Book. A good way, of course, to flaunt your power is to amass large amounts of land and property, and it was for this reason, in the year 1107, that Borough was leased to the Bishop of Winchester, who at the time was William Gifford, for the princely sum of £8 per year. Essentially, this put Borough under the control of the Bishops of Winchester, a setup that would go on to last some 500 years. And it was for this reason that Winchester Palace was built, as a means of acting as an administrative centre, and also to provide a luxury home for the bishops to use whenever they're in Westminster on business. In its heyday, Winchester Palace was pretty big, stretching down to and along the Thames. It also had a 50-acre park. Underneath the palace there was an ample wine cellar, which was accessible from the river, that being the quickest way in those days to keep the large stocks of booze topped up. Being such a prominent place, Winchester Palace hosted many a banquet in its day and was often frequented by royalty. James I of Scotland, for example, had his wedding reception here following his marriage to Joan Beaufort in 1424, and it's believed Henry VIII met his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, at a do here, which proved most unfortunate for her, as that marriage ended up with the loss of her head. As mentioned earlier, because Borough lay outside the control of the City of London, things were, to put it politely, a lot freer down here, and as such, the area thrived with taverns, gambling dens, and brothels, or stews as they were known back then. And, as the Bishops of Winchester owned the land and property where all of this sinful behaviour occurred, it puts them in a position where they were little better than mob bosses. In short, these holy men made a pretty penny from vice, by collecting rent from the brothels and taxing the women who worked in them. Not really the sort of thing you'd expect the church to dabble in now, is it? It was thanks to this curious arrangement that the women who worked in the borough's stews came to be nicknamed Winchester Geese. In the 12th century, a long list of regulations were drawn up to govern the brothels in which the Winchester Geese plied their trade. Amongst other things, these rules forbade women from enticing men into a stew by pulling at their clothes, and if a punter wasn't interested, it was also prohibited to pull faces or throw stones at them. If you were caught doing that, the fine was 3 shillings and 4pence. Although such rules were rather forward-thinking for the time, indeed a number of them were designed to offer the women protection, the way in which the so-called Winchester Geese were treated by the bishops when it came to death was, as we'll later see, hypocritical in the extreme. By the way, on a completely different note, it's worth mentioning, if film locations are your thing, that Pickford's Wharf can be spotted towards the very end of the 1981 comedy horror classic, An American Werewolf in London. Although the film's climax, in which David Kessler goes on the rampage in werewolf form, takes place around Piccadilly Circus, the very last scene, in which he's cornered by police in an alleyway, was shot right here. Although as you can see, it now looks rather different to the way in which it appeared in the early 1980s. Even more so, as a false wall was installed at this spot to make the road look like it was a dead end. Although there's a fair few pubs in and around Borough today, the number now on offer is nothing when compared to the medieval era. Back then, Borough High Street was chock full of them, and even as late as the 17th century, the satirist Thomas Dekker described the High Street as being a continued alehouse with not a shop to be seen. A number of these old taverns were large coaching inns, employed as terminals for stagecoaches heading to and from London and southern England, and such establishments were similar, in a way, to modern airport terminals, being places where people would await to begin their journey, having a meal and, in many cases, a few tankards of ale whilst doing so. The inns which accommodated travellers were known as galleried taverns, as they were built around a central courtyard, thus providing a space where coaches could put into. Today, only one example of a galleried tavern survives on Borough High Street, that being the George, which dates back to 1676. Meanwhile, several names of pubs that have long since vanished live on in the names of tiny alleys which are tucked away off of Borough High Street. Two of which, despite now looking rather nondescript, are worth a look due to their historic connections. The first is Talbot's Yard, which was once home to the Tabard Inn. The Tabard Inn is notable for featuring in one of the greatest works of early English literature, the Canterbury Tales, a collection of short stories written by Geoffrey Chaucer between 1387 and 1400. The Canterbury Tales focuses on a group of pilgrims who, like so many folk from that era, embark upon a trek from London to Canterbury in order to pay homage to the shrine of Sir Thomas Becket, the former archbishop who was brutally slain within Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 and whose murder transformed him into a cult-like figure. The pilgrimage route to Canterbury commenced on Borough High Street, which is another reason why so many pubs sprung up along here. And in the Canterbury Tales, the group of pilgrims take it in turn to share stories along the course of their journey. A competition essentially, with whoever is judged to have the best tale being promised a slap-up meal in a Tabard Inn upon the group's return to London. Despite being over 600 years old, the Canterbury Tales are surprisingly funny and very crude too. The plot of The Miller's Tale, for example, revolves around a woman named Alison who sticks her bottom out of a window and tricks a fellow into kissing it. British humour at its best. Back over at Southwark Cathedral, you can see a stained glass window dedicated to Chaucer. Not everyone though is so enamoured with the pubs Borough had to offer. One such gentleman being a fellow named John Harvard. John Harvard was born in this part of London in 1607 and was baptised in St Saviour's, now Southwark Cathedral. When he was 18, an outbreak of plague wiped out almost the entire family. Only John, his brother Thomas, and his mother Catherine survived. Catherine later remarried, and in doing so, she inherited a pub on Borough High Street named the Queen's Head, which once stood here, the rather unassuming location now marked by an alley bearing its name. When Catherine died in 1635, John inherited the Queen's Head. However, being a rather pious man, he had little interest in pursuing a career as a pub landlord, and so decided to sell the business. Shortly after, in 1637, John used the proceeds from this transaction to help he and his wife Anne emigrate to Massachusetts. Sadly, John wasn't able to enjoy his new life in America for very long. He died of tuberculosis just 1 year after his arrival, although before he passed away, he made sure to bequeath £780, which is roughly $135,000 in today's money, along with his large collection of books, to a fledgling college which was beginning to establish itself in the area. And in honour of this generous donation, it's for this reason that this establishment is now named Harvard University. In recognition of this impressive local connection, Southwark Cathedral maintains the Harvard Chapel, which is a beautiful and very peaceful place indeed. Today, one of the main attractions in Borough is Shakespeare's Globe, which, if you want to experience what a trip to the theatre was like during Shakespeare's day, is well worth a visit. The Globe, or as Shakespeare himself calls it in the opening to Henry V, this wooden O that we see today, is of course a reconstruction. It opened here in 1997, following a long and very worthy campaign led by the American actor Sam Wanamaker, who sadly died in 1993, meaning he didn't live to see his dream come to fruition. For practical reasons, the reconstructed globe couldn't be rebuilt at the exact spot where it once stood. For many years that site was covered by a brewery. Although that original location isn't far away at all, it's just a few minutes walk away on this quiet little corner off of Park Street, a residential complex which, rather appropriately, is named Old Theatre Court. The perimeter of the Globe Theatre is marked by this simple curved line, and the site is also commemorated with this large plaque, funded with donations by friends from the USA and India, which shows a relief map of Borough as it appeared in Shakespeare's time. As historic as this site is, it wasn't even the original Globe's first home. The theatre was first constructed north of the Thames, in Shoreditch, which was then outside the eastern edge of the city, and where it was first known as the Curtain Theatre, which, as you can probably guess, is where Curtain Road gets its name from. In 1599, following a dispute with the landlord, Shakespeare and his company of actors, the Lord Chamberlain's men, dismantled the theatre, which was easily done as it was made entirely from wood, and carted it across London Bridge to Borough, where they quickly rebuilt it as the Globe. Borough was an ideal location, because, despite being held in high esteem today, drama back then was seen as a rowdy, grubby entertainment, and as such the Globe fitted in well with the area's seedy atmosphere. Furthermore, the Globe wasn't the first Elizabethan theatre to be built here. That was the Rose, which stood just opposite, and also staged Shakespeare's plays. Some remains of the Rose Theatre do exist, hidden away off Park Street, but unfortunately they're not currently open to the public, and all we have to go by at the moment is this blue plaque. A far more brutal venue, which also stood in this vicinity, was the Bear Garden, a site which is recalled in the name of this quiet street. As I'm sure you can imagine, the garden's name is something of a misnomer, for the gardens in question were in fact a bear baiting pit, that savage blood sport being played out here to drunken crowds. A rude and nasty pleasure, as Samuel Pepys once described it. The Borough Bear Garden was established in the late 1500s, and in January 1583, part of the arena collapsed, killing 8 people. What a shame. Interestingly, it's very possible that there was a direct link between the Bear Gardens and the Globe Theatre. You see, although Shakespeare's plays are notable for not having many clear stage directions, there's one in particular that's very explicit, and which stands out because it's so unusual. You'll find it in Act 3 of The Winter's Tale, which was first staged at the Globe in 1611, and in which Shakespeare tells us the character, Antigonus, should exit pursued by a bear. Although having an actor chased off stage by a bear is tricky to pull off nowadays, it would have been far easier during Shakespeare's day, for all the company had to do was pop over to the nearby bear garden and ask if they could borrow one for the evening. If we return to Southwark Cathedral, it's worth noting that you'll find a memorial to William Shakespeare here, for the bard was once a parishioner of St Saviour's. His younger brother Edmund, who died at age 27 in 1607, also happens to be buried here, and it's most likely William paid for and arranged a funeral, the details of which included a forenoon knell of the great bell. For our final site, we return now to the Winchester Geese, and a melancholy little place known as Crossbones Graveyard. Standing on the corner of what's now Red Cross Way and Union Street, Crossbones Yard was first established as a burial site for the women who worked in the area's brothels. You see, although the bishops of Winchester were happy to collect cash from them whilst they were alive and working, once a Winchester Goose passed away, she was considered heathen, and as such, was not permitted to be buried within consecrated ground. Crossbones Yard was the solution, a simple burial site where the women were laid to rest, once their tough lives had come to an end. Over the course of the following centuries, Crossbones Yard also began to take in paupers' bodies too, and in doing so, it remained in use right up until 1853, although by that point London's burial crisis was reaching its zenith, and it was said that Crossbones had become so full, it was possible to see fresh body parts poking through the thin layer of topsoil. In all, it's estimated some 15,000 souls were buried here. The small site was rediscovered many years later in the 1990s when construction work for the Jubilee Line extension was underway, and for some time the area was under threat of redevelopment. Fortunately, a campaign led by the Friends of Crossbones saved the old ground, and it now serves as a community garden, although if you plan on visiting, do be sure to check beforehand, as opening times are limited. Whether or not the garden is open though, you can always view this impressive and very emotive gate on Red Cross Way, which forms part of Crossbones Yard. It's known as the Memorial to the Outcast Dead, and the many ribbons and personal mementos seen here have all been left to honour individuals who, just like the Winchester Geese, passed away whilst living on the edge of society. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Borough's more hidden areas. I'd love to hear your own thoughts on this historic part of London. What's your favourite spot? And are there any other secret parts of Borough you can think of that you'd like to share? If so, please be sure to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to all of you who support my channel with your kind words, likes and shares. I couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it would be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.